Hey everyone, I'm Shah and I'm back with the second video in the series on using large language models in practice. In this video, I'm going to talk all about OpenAI's Python API. So I'll start with an overview of what an API is and other key concepts before diving into some example code and showing you how to make your very own chatbot. So with that, let's get into it. Like I just mentioned, this video is going to be all about OpenAI's Python API. And the goal of this is to serve as both a complete and beginner-friendly guide. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with what's an API, then I'm going to move on to specifically OpenAI's Python API. Then I'm going to talk about how to get started, setting up an account, and other things like that. And then finally, we'll get into some example code going over both the basics and showing you how to make a chatbot with the API. So the million-dollar question, what is an API? I feel like this is just thrown around in so many different contexts that people will often be familiar with the term, but not so familiar of what it actually means. And so an API stands for Application Programming Interface, and here I'll define it as a way to interact with a remote application programmatically. So while that might sound very technical and very scary, it's not. Let's just consider the following analogy. Suppose this is you and you've got a craving for some Salvadorian pupusas that you had during your Latin America trip from last summer. However, you're back home and you don't know where you can find pupusas in your hometown. But lucky for you, you have a super foodie friend that knows every single restaurant in town. And so, if you were trying to figure out where you can go find great pupusas, you might send your friend a message, hey, any good pupusa spots in town? And then, maybe a few minutes later, your super foodie friend would respond, yes, Flavors of El Salvador has the best pupusas. And so basically what just happened here is you sent your friend a request and then a little bit later your friend sent back a response. And while this might sound completely irrelevant to programming and Python and what we're talking about here, this is essentially how APIs work. What this can look like in the context of OpenAI's Python API is instead of texting your friend your request, you can send OpenAI a request using Python, and then OpenAI will send back a response which you can capture and use for whatever downstream task you like. For example, let's say you want to send a API request to one of OpenAI's language models. And if you saw the previous video of the series, you saw that a core task of language models is given a string of words to predict the very next word. And so let's say we send OpenAI this string, listen to your, and we want to get back the very next word. The response we may receive could be heart. And so as we can see, this is very similar to the ChatGPT web interface, but instead of going to their website, typing in a prompt in the UI, you're essentially doing the same thing, but you're sending over your prompt using Python and this API as opposed to natural language and using their web interface. And so you might think, what's the upside of doing it this way? This just sounds like the same thing with more steps. While there is a lot of overlap, there are unique features in the API that are just not available in the easy user interface that is ChatGPT. One example is a customizable system message. This is essentially a message that you can use to set the tone for your chatbot, basically set the context, give it its motivation, its task. For ChatGPT, what this might look like is, I am ChatGPT, a large language model trained by OpenAI based on the GPT 3.5 architecture. My knowledge is based on information available up until September 2021. Today's date is July 13th, 2023. And so you can imagine that you want to make your own chatbot and you don't necessarily want it to be called ChatGPT, and maybe you wanted to do something more specific than this. And so you can really set that with the system message. Some other things are you can adjust input parameters such as the maximum length of the response that is sent back from the language model. Also the number of responses that you get back. So in ChatGPT, you'll type in a prompt and you'll just get one response. But what if you want to get 10 responses and compare them programmatically? This is something that would be a bit more time consuming using ChatGPT as opposed to using Python. And then finally, you can adjust adjust the temperature, which is like the randomness of the response generated by the language model. But we'll get more into that later in the video. Also, you can process other types of input, not just text, so images or other file types. You can extract helpful word embeddings for downstream tasks. If you go to ChatGPT, you input text, it'll spit text out. But let's say you want a numerical representation of the input text, so you can use that for some downstream processing. You can also pass an audio to the API for transcription or translation tasks. And then finally, there's some model fine-tuning functionality built into the API. So even though it may seem like more work to use Python to interact with GPT 3.5 or GPT-4, you get all these additional features using the API that just are not available with the ChatGPT user interface. And then it's not just GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 that is available to you. There are also a bunch of other models. And so here's a quick snapshot of them. Feel free to pause the video if you actually want to read this. This is also available in the blog associated with this video if you want to read more about these models. Additionally, there is a full documentation on OpenAI's website linked here. Before getting into how to actually use the API, I think one thing at the top of a lot of people's minds when it comes to a paid service is how much is this thing going to cost me? And so in order to understand that, we first need to understand the concept of a token, which here I'll define as a set of words and characters represented by a set of numbers. So suppose we have the text "the end" with a period at the end. While you and I as humans can read this and understand it, unfortunately a language model, or more specifically a neural network, does not understand this text directly. Language models understand numbers. So we need to translate this text into a numerical representation so that the language model can actually understand it and do something with it. So let's say we translate "the end" into this list of integers. So what we did is we took text and we translated it into numbers. But what do these numbers actually mean? And so let's say the relationship between the text and the integers here is shown by this mapping here. So the word "the" is represented by 73, a space followed by the word "end" is represented by the number 102, and then the period is represented by a 6. These three things that make up this text are tokens. Obviously, these won't be the only tokens we have. We'll actually have a huge set of these words and characters and their corresponding numerical representations, and this will make up the set of all our tokens and the vocabulary that we're using. And so the reason this is relevant to pricing is that pricing with OpenAI's API is based on the number of tokens sent to the API and the number of tokens returned. So that means bigger prompts and bigger responses will have larger costs. Additionally, there are different costs per token associated with different models, and you can read more about that on OpenAI's website linked here. Okay, so now let's start to see how we can actually use the API to do something. But before we get into the example code, we first have to do a few steps to get our account set up and get into a place where we can actually start making API calls. And so there are 4 steps here. First, we need to make an account. Second, we need to add a payment method. Third, we can set usage limits. And then finally, we need to get our secret key to actually make the API calls. And so for this, I'm going to switch over to OpenAI's website, which is here. So the URL is platform.openai.com/overview. And the first thing we want to do is make an account. The way to do that, super simple. Go up to this top right corner, click the sign up button, and then you can create an account using your email address or continue with any of these. Continue with Google, Microsoft, or Apple. If you've used ChatGPT in the past, odds are you already have an OpenAI account. And if that's the case, you can just hit this log in button here. And since I already have an OpenAI account, I'll just go ahead and log into mine. Here we go. Now that you've made your account or that you're logged in, now we can go to the next step, which is to add a payment method. How to do that is you can click on your profile in the top right corner, and then you can click on manage account. To add a payment method, go to this billing tab here, and then there's this thing called payment methods. So you can click on that and add a payment method pretty easily. The next step is to set usage limits. So this is something I recommend. This will help you set hard and soft limits to how many API calls you can make. This will just ensure that you don't spend any more money than you expect on API calls. There are 2 options here. There's a hard limit and a soft limit. The hard limit, basically, once you hit that number, so in my case, I put it as $5. Once I hit $5, any additional API call will get rejected. So you will not be charged more than this number here. And then there's also also a soft limit, and basically when you hit the soft limit, OpenAI will send you an email, hey, you've hit your soft limit threshold. And so this kind of helps you make sure you're not going off the rails with API calls. For a little context, I spent a few days playing around with the API, writing example code for this video and so on, and I spent a whopping 3 cents. So the API calls are pretty cheap, unless you're deploying a product where you have many users making API calls on a specific account. That's when this number will probably go up a lot. But I would imagine for personal use, you probably will not hit more than $1 if you're not really using this API a whole lot. And then finally, you need to get your secret key. And so for that, click on this API keys thing, and you'll see a screen like this. If you've never done this before, you won't see any API keys here. So you need to create a new one. And the way to do that is really easy. You just click this. You can say new secret key. I'll give it whatever name you want. Then you can click this create secret key button, and then it's going to create this secret key for you. It's important that you copy this and save it somewhere safe and accessible to you, because this is the only time you're going to get access to this key. Just show you that if I hit done, the key I just made, it just shows me the last 4 digits of it. So I don't know anything else in between. So if I didn't copy it, then I wouldn't be able to use it. So now that we've made our account, added a payment method, set usage limits, and obtained a secret key, we can now finally start coding. So starting with the basics, we need to import the OpenAI Python library. If you haven't installed this, super simple, just pip install OpenAI and it should download it automatically in your terminal. This line here, I'm importing my secret key. So what I did is I created a Python file called sk.py, and in there I just defined one variable, which is called mysk, and I set that equal to my secret key. We can see what that looks like here. So I have this Jupyter notebook, and then I have this sk.py. If we open that, we have this Python file with just one variable, mysk, and it's equal to a string. And so here is where you will copy paste your string. I copied it from earlier, so I'll just throw it there. So you should never do this. You shouldn't just make your secret key visible to people on a public medium like YouTube, but I'm just going to revoke this key right after, so you won't get the chance to use my $5 of API credits. So this is just like a clean way to do it. You just import the key, and then you can copy paste whatever key you want in here. You can revoke access, create a new one, paste it here without ever having to change your code. And then you can set what API key you want to use using the syntax here. So OpenAI.API key, you just set it to my secret key. Alternatively, if you don't want to go through all this of create another file and import the secret key like this, you can always just manually paste your secret key right here. So we got that set up, and now we can make our first API call. The way to do this is really simple. So we have this chat completion module, and then there's this method called create. So here we are just passing in 2 inputs. We pass in the model we want to use, and we pass in the messages. Taking a closer look at this messages thing here, messages is going to be a list of dictionaries. Here we have a list with only one element. So this element is a dictionary, and then the dictionary has 2 key value pairs. So the first one is we define the role of whoever is saying this message. So here we say user. Alternatively, you could put system to define the system message, or you could put assistant to define some text generated by the chatbot. Then you define the content. So this is essentially what that role said. And so here, keeping with the listen to your example, we're going to pass that in as content from the user. Essentially, this is our request to the API. It is all baked into this method here. What we get returned back is actually the response from the API. And so this will be in a JSON format, which is essentially like a dictionary. So we can print it, and we see that it has a bunch of different fields in it. So there's this ID, object, created, model, choices, usage, so on and so forth. Most of these are not important to what we're talking about here. If you want to know what each of these mean, I have a definition for each of these in the blog associated with this video, published in Towards Data Science. But the only important field for the discussion here is this choices field, because that is what is going to hold the response from the language model, in this case GPT 3.5 Turbo. if we take a closer look, we can see that choices will in of itself have an index field and a message field, and then the message field will have role and content fields in them. Basically, we just want to extract the content, and to do that we can use this syntax here. Chat completion is this dictionary like object here. We can access the choices, which is this first field here. We can get the first choice essentially, so index 0. Then we can access the message of this first choice, so now we're here. And then finally we can grab the content, which is this line here. It is very hierarchical, but that kind of helps keep all this information very organized. So that was our very first API call. But this wasn't anything special. This is equivalent to going to ChatGPT and just typing in listen to your. This doesn't make use of a lot of the other features of the API. So let's see what else we can do. So one is we can set the input parameters max tokens, which will adjust the maximum number of tokens that are allowed in the response from the language model. Let's say I just want a one-word response. So what I can do is have the same exact API request, but I'll add this max tokens parameter and set it equal to 1. If we do that and print it out, we actually get the same exact response, but notice there's no period. So what that tells us is heart is actually a token in the vocabulary of GPT 3.5 Turbo, and the period is another token. Let's see what else we can do. Next, we can set this n parameter, which controls the number of responses sent back from the language model. So in this case, we have essentially the same API request as before. Now we're setting the max tokens equal to 2, and then we're setting n equal to 5. And so what this will do is return back 5 chat completions for us. We can get those back and we can print them in this for loop here. And then we can see we get heart, heart and heart again, a new line character, I'm guessing, then heart, comma, a new line character, heart, comma. And so notice these aren't all the same thing. And this could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the use case. For example, if you're trying to create some AI tool that'll help you in some creative task, maybe you do want these to be a little random and out there. On the other side, maybe you're automating some business process or standard process and you want it to be very deterministic. You want the output to be very predictable and identical every single time it's called. And so it turns out we can control this degree of randomness or predictability using the temperature parameter. Temperature is this input parameter that essentially controls the randomness of the response. And this will take values between 0 and 2. So a temperature value of 0 will make the responses very deterministic, so very predictable. While on the other extreme, a temperature equal to 2 will make the responses very random and out there. To see what this looks like, we have the same exact API call from the previous slide, but now we're setting the temperature equal to 0. So we're making this very predictable and deterministic. And lo and behold, we get the same exact thing for all 5 responses. Heart period, heart period, heart period. Basically, this is the most probable 2 tokens that will follow the text listen to your. But let's see what happens when we crank the temperature up. So let's set temperature equal to 2, same exact API call, and now we get some really interesting chat completions. First we get listen to your judgment, makes sense. Listen to your advice, okay, that's good. Listen to your inner awareness, interesting. Listen to your heart. So notice we still got this most probable outcome. So raising the temperature doesn't necessarily mean you get low probability and wild responses. It just means that those low probability responses have a higher likelihood of actually showing up in your chat completion. And then finally we have ging ist, which I don't know what that means. So listen to your ging ist. Okay, so those were the basics of OpenAI's Python API. Now let's see what a more advanced example could look like. The code that we just went through and the code that we're about to go through is all available on the GitHub repository. And so this is essentially the code we just ran through. And here's the setup, our first API call, the max tokens, the number of chat completions, the temperature stuff. And now into the demo. Let's say for whatever reason, we wanted to create a lyric completion assistant. This could be some service this where people know the first line of a song but don't remember the lyrics for the rest of the song, so they'll just put in the first line and then this lyric completion assistant will fill it in. Or maybe they're writing their own music and they are kind of getting stumped on what the next line in the lyric should be, so they can use this lyric completion assistant to help them do that creative task. With this chat completion API, making a custom chatbot is like stupid easy. Basically, all we have to do is define these messages that will precede the conversation that the user will have with the assistant. So there are a couple ways we can do this. One, we can use the system message to set the context for the chatbot, or we can have some example back and forth between the user and the assistant so the chatbot gets an idea of how to respond to user requests. Or, of course, we can do both, which is what we're doing in this example. Here, we set the system message as, I am Roxette Lyric Completion Assistant. When given a line from a song, I will provide the next line in the song. So that's the system message. And then we have two example back and forths between the user and the assistant. So the user will say, I know there's something in the wake of your smile. The assistant will say, I get a notion from the look in your eyes. Yeah. The user will then say, you've built a love, but that love falls apart. And then the assistant says, your little piece of heaven turns too dark. Then we'll pass in one last message, which is the same message we've used throughout this entire demo, which is listen to your, and then we can see what the chatbot spits out. So this code is essentially doing what we did before. We're making the API call using GPT 3.5 Turbo. Instead of a list with just one dictionary, we have this messages list, which actually has 5 dictionaries in it. Here we set the number of responses to 1, and we set the temperature to 0, so it becomes very predictable. Here's where a little magic is happening. So we're going to print the response from the chatbot, but then we're going to take the response from the chatbot and we're going to append it to the end of the messages list, which will then get fed right back into the chatbot. So essentially the chatbot will just loop on as long as we want, going off its previous responses. And so here's what the output of all that looks like. So we passed in listen to your, and then the chatbot said heart when he's calling for you. Listen to your heart. There's nothing else you can do. I don't know where you're going and I don't know why, but listen to your heart before I tell him goodbye. These are powerful lyrics from this chatbot, and they actually correspond exactly to the hit Roxette song Listen to Your Heart, and whose actual lyrics we can see here. But here's a little bonus. So let's see what happens when we crank the temperature. What if the Roxette song went a little differently? So here we put temperature equal to 0. So we have listen to your I reach into the shadows, summon sweet Elaine, pointing all steel values, fails if friends remote empty reply, new line character, image existing, long seconds confirm flesh pressed secretly, remember saint talk, dying to unfamiliar pieces, father blessed, speech keeps passing shape, raises you travel feeling, shadows thriven, body swept, spirit consume. So not entirely sure what that means. So this could be some, new genre of art, postmodern techno chatbot AI art, or it could just be meaningless gibberish. So you can't really tell with this kind of stuff. So again, example code is available on the GitHub repository shown here and linked down in the description below. And so what's next in this video series? One obvious downside of using OpenAI's API is that you have to pay for these API calls, which if you're building some product or service, it may not scale well because if you have thousands, tens of thousands or more users, these costs can start adding up pretty quickly. So in these instances, we can turn to open source solutions where you don't have to pay for API calls. You have some other way of hosting these language models. So this is where the Hugging Face Transformers library can help. Hugging Face is an AI community that is building the future. This is just a screenshot from their website, which is also listed here. Hugging Face maintains this Python library called Transformers, which essentially makes downloading and training powerful pre-trained language models really easy. And so in the next video of this series, I'm going to be talking all about that and sharing example code. And so if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with others. If you have any questions about large language models or the OpenAI API, please feel free to drop those in the comment section below. This whole series is part of my learning journey and process, so I do find a lot of value in the questions that I receive because it prompts me to dive more deeply into this stuff, which I really enjoy. And as always, thank you so much for your time and thanks for watching.